Hello, Bill.
Good morning, Matt.
Welcome to the DMZ, everyone.
Uh,
Snowy southern DMZ.
so you're having a snowier time than we are, but I am pretty sure we beat you in cold.
Yeah. It was a little cold here, but yeah, the snow was the big thing, and but we're back in action. You know, we bounced back here. People say that Washington D.C. can't deal with the storm. Well, look who's talking now. Uh,
We had six
back.
inches. Whoa!
uh,
Congratulations.
yeah. How much have you had total, Bill?
I don't know what were the totals in Western Mass. We haven't been as bad as Boston and Worcester. I think Boston. I think there's a place in Maine that's had over 90 inches so far this season. I'm pretty sure Boston's had over 70. I don't know off the top of my head exactly what we've had here, but it's probably more like 50 or 60. I'm guessing. Uh, but right now we've had like sub-zero wind chill for several days. We were below 10 wind chill here in Western Mass over the weekend, and so my family decided to escape that by taking a family trip to Brattleboro, Vermont, where the wind chill was below 20. But we had a perfectly good liberal vacation. We took the train. We went to the most liberal state in the country. We did everything on foot. We were a nice, compact, smart growth town. We stayed at a hotel that is attached to a movie theater, so we could I could walk down the hall and get popcorn and bring it back to the hotel room and watch a movie in the hotel room.
That is
And
nice. Sometimes my wife and I will stay just to get away at the Ritz Carlton in Georgetown,
yeah,
which is attached to a theater, and you can actually smell. There's parts of the hotel where you can smell the popcorn, like from a movie theater. There's nothing better than the movie theater popcorn smell.
right,
I didn't even go to the movies, but you can just get that popcorn smell.
right,
I love it.
right.
Great.
And so even though it was freezing cold, we were inside most of the time. Very short walks to restaurants. Tooth block walks. Saw a domino presentation at the Brattleboro Museum, which is attached to the train station there. So it was a perfectly good progressive getaway. Good to have kids in a
But
train and not the
Massachusetts just
car.
isn't liberal enough for
Right,
you.
right. Hey, we were
Well, it's
we were
just
Republican governor now, so if you need an extra dose of socialism, you got to get out of Dodge and get to Vermont.
yeah, times must be really tough there in Massachusetts, Bill. No, but look, you don't have to always go to a tropical climate. Just getting out of the house is good for the soul sometimes this time of year.
My kids are young enough
Um,
to like, yeah, we're sleeping in a hotel. It's a different bed. Yay!
oh yeah, nothing like it. Sometimes my mother-in-law will take the kids for like a Saturday night and take them to a hotel with an indoor swimming pool, like in the winter, where they can go swimming in the pool and like they wouldn't care. We could take them to Hawaii, or we could take them to the, you know, Courtyard by Marriott. It doesn't really matter to them. It could be in Falls Church, but if there's an indoor swimming pool, and they're blown away at this age, so it's fine. Um, anyway,
I'm a little out of it though because I was away for 3 days. I mean, I'm keeping cursory tabs on the news, but you might know a little bit more than me what's popping right now in the Beltway.
well, I've been a little out of it too there, Bill, but I'll do my best. The big story as we're taping today, Jeb Bush is speaking in Chicago. Apparently, he's rolling out, I think, 21 national security advisors. I believe, according to the Washington Post, at least all of whom served either in his father or his brother's administration. Meanwhile, Politico has a piece out sort of delving into the shock and awe campaign that Jeb Bush is rolling out. And I have a piece at the Daily Caller about the Jeb Bush blitzkrieg. And as I was reading these stories this morning about Bush really making moves, um, I was hit by these sort of conflicting schizophrenic emotions. Like on one hand, Bill, I was sort of found it repellent. Here you've got another Bush surrounding himself with the same old Bush advisors who got us into this mess to begin with. And I'm not just talking about the country, Bill. I'm talking about the Republican Party and the conservative movement's mess with their loyalists and their money And here they are, with their juggernaut rolling over everybody, circling wagons, and sort of uh, ambling toward the nomination. And on the other hand, uh, you have this other sense that, like, wow, Jeb Bush is actually doing stuff, and like he's the fact that I'm a little bit like concerned by how quickly he's moving perhaps implies he could actually win the damn thing. That he's actually going to run a competent campaign. I think it's true that in the past 25 years, right, only Republicans named Bush have gotten elected president. So, so could it be that like he's the only hope Republicans have, and that the fact that other candidates are like playing this Hamlet act or slowly putting together super PACs while Bush is like out there doing stuff, maybe help me Obi-Wan, maybe he's the our last best hope. I don't know.
Well, I feel like, obviously, all sorts of things can happen over the course of a 18-month campaign. Jeb Bush would certainly step in it and ruin the momentum he's built for himself. But it would appear that, and I usually think, when you get in is kind of a silly debate to have. You just, get in at some point and do what you got to do, and how you perform the campaign trail is far more important. But I think Jeb, making his move in December really has squeezed out other establishment candidates. I think it's sunk Romney's hope, or at least contributed to him sinking Romney's hope. Chris Christie's having a hard time getting traction. Rubio's having a hard time getting traction. So it's possible, depending on how things play out, we might look back at it and say, wow, Jeb, striking when he did, the timing and the smooth follow through after the announcement really locked down that corner of the party and made it possible for him to get the eventual nomination. So you have to tip your hat to that. But obviously, he has to know that everyone is going to be looking for him to break with his brother in some way. That, whatever sweet sentiments you might see in polls about Bush, maybe you don't have the same kind of antipathy towards him you had 5 years ago. I don't think people still look at that as a good 8-year run. People still remember the crash. They still didn't like the Iraq War, and they want to see.
Well, Bill, I totally agree. To me, the point I'm making, and maybe I didn't make it well in the piece, is I think there are sort of two conflicting things, right? On one hand, he's a winner. And guess what? George W. Bush was a winner. He won elections. And Republicans have not won elections, national elections, in a long time. And there's a hunger for someone who is a winner. And so on one hand, I think you could look to Bush and say, he's going to win, he's a winner. Somehow these guys know how to get it done and know how to win. Say what you will about George W. Bush, but he won 2 elections. Granted, he lost the popular vote the first time. Utterly irrelevant, right? On the other hand, you look at all the things you're saying, Bill, and whether it's the nation, what George W. Bush did to the nation, or whether it's what he did to the Republican Party, not that the two are unrelated, but they're slightly different. Why on earth would you want to do that? And, the fact that Bush, he's going to say, apparently in his remarks, I'm my own man, which is the kind of thing that if you have to say, it's probably not saying you're funny. It just doesn't really work. So I think those are two conflicting issues, right? Republicans want a winner, and he seems like he might be the best person to actually win. And then on the other hand, the Bush baggage.
Well, I've watched the two last big Jeb speeches. I think he said something along the lines of "I'm my own man" in the Q&A part of his. Actually, maybe both of them. They're blurring together in my mind. But I know he said it in these recent pieces, these recent stump speeches. But I don't necessarily knock him for leaning on old Bush advisors. I thought it was an unfair knock on Obama that he brought back a lot of Clinton advisors. You said you're going to be about changing Washington. Now it's the same old people. What's the difference? Well, there was a difference in what he did. He got healthcare passed and Clinton didn't. He
Right.
tried to regulate Wall Street and didn't try to deregulate Wall Street. Even though Larry Summers might have been there, but he did something different when he got there. So who cares?
And
I
of
think
course, there's a huge difference between 41 and 43 advice. I mean, Brent Snowcroft. I mean,
absolutely.
I don't think he's involved in this. But I mean, there have been examples of somebody who opposed the Iraq invasion, right, but was very significant in George H.W. Bush's presidency. So the fact that we're lumping them all together, it's an easy thing to say that they all worked in one of their administrations. But obviously, well, like if you're looking for an advisor who has foreign policy experience at the national level in the past 25 years, wouldn't they have
in the Bush White House? That's it. There's nobody else.
Wouldn't they have had to have worked essentially in a Bush White House? I mean, who
same
out
thing,
there?
And same thing with Democrats. If you're going to have a Democrat with White House experience, he's going to have worked for Carter or Clinton. I mean, those are your choices. So that's, and you might want to have some fresh blood, but you can't have a White House with all fresh blood. You need to have someone who's been there before. But the guy at the top makes the call. The guy at the top is the person who decides on the strategic direction of the White House. So what's important?
So you're
for
making
Jeb,
a good argument for Jeb. For Jeb, it sounds like, Bill. You're arguing that is irrelevant.
Well, I do think that in and of itself is irrelevant, but he has yet to show me, and obviously what I say is what matters here. He has yet to prove to me that he is going to reckon with the failures on his brother's watch. I don't blame him, and I wrote this recently. If he wants to say, I love my brother and I think he was great. He was a great president. If you want to say that, everyone sort of says, he's your brother. You don't have to be a dick to your brother. I get that. But you got to say something, explicitly or implicitly, along the lines of, I think we've learned that cutting tax rates for the top tax bracket in and of itself didn't magically create jobs, didn't prevent a global crash. The enforcement strategy of, say, the last two presidents or three presidents didn't stop the 2008 crash. We have to learn from that error. We know now that just having the best military in the world doesn't guarantee that a war is going to work out for us diplomatically or foreign policy-wise. He's got to give something like that to show I have learned a lesson from the past. And I think this is true for any Republican, not just Jeb.
Yeah.
It's just more... But I would have thought that Jeb would actually have an easier time of it because any hint of daylight, like, wow, he's different than his brother. But he hasn't done anything like that yet. Everything he's proposing sounds like his brother at this point.
He definitely needs to do it. And I think this is where the sort of Bush loyalty thing becomes a drag. I mean, he may not have the ability to do it. Ability is the wrong word, but there is that Bush loyalty thing that gave us heck of a job Brownie, and Jeb may not be willing to do what he needs to do to distance himself. Although I guess W was able to distance himself from the old man, right? So maybe to the two conservatives, so maybe Jeb can do the reverse.
I mean, I think he totally can do it, just does he have the gumption to do it?
Yeah. And the fire in the belly, like, is he? You have to sort of, desperation is the wrong word, but like ambition, whatever, like forces you to do things that are a little bit uncomfortable, and he may not be willing to do those things because he may not need the job that bad. The other thing is conservatives, Bill, are pissed off about other things. I mean, that Bush did, like not vetoing bills, spending bills, like not having a successor, like. There were a lot of problems, and even if you aren't upset about the original Iraq invasion, he stuck with his loyalists so long, listening to Rumsfeld and others, and it took him way too long to pull the trigger and go with the Petraeus model and the surge, which I would argue actually worked and helped stabilize Iraq. So there's just a lot of problems with the Bush presidency that it's not even a simplistic like. It's not even simplistic to the point where like Democrats might just reflexively hate Bush, but there's so many problems. Even if you give Bush the benefit of the doubt and you don't reflexively hate him, there's so many problems with that administration: the cronyism, the loyalism, the loyalty, all those things. And by the way, Bill, I just went back and was reading David Foster Wallace's Rolling Stone essay where he followed John McCain around in 2000, and I've got a lot of thoughts to do with that. One of them, though, you just mentioned, where McCain. I think McCain got beat up for this, but McCain just had an ad that said, I'm not saying I want to raise your taxes, but what I want to do is take this budget surplus and I want to cut some taxes, but I also want to shore up Social Security and I want to put some of the money away for a rainy day fund or something like that. That was McCain's message. And I think he was branded like a rhino for that, It's just amazing. And then I was thinking another thing, Bill, just, right now, we're going to talk about this later, but Republicans are fighting about this Department of Homeland Security bill, and there are some, whether or not to fully fund the DHS. And I'm recalling, how the attacks on Max Cleland for voting against, he was essentially implicitly compared to bin Laden and Saddam Hussein because he voted against some provisions of the Department of Homeland Security or something. So it is funny how things have changed so much since the Bush era.
Well, you mentioned about W. Bush and Iraq. I mean, that's something that Jeb could actually use to his advantage. He could say, "Look, I think we learned something from the Iraq invasion. I think my brother learned, when he got rid of Rumsfeld and he changed strategy and adopted the Petraeus-Surge model, which was more sophisticated than shock and awe. It had a stronger diplomatic component, reaching out to Sunni tribal elders than the initial strategy did, and the combination of increased military involvement and souped up diplomatic involvement actually turned things around. I think we need to learn from those mistakes, which my brother learned, and I think there's a nation we've learned. I think you take a shot at Obama. I think Obama didn't learn that. Obama pulled out prematurely, and everything's falling apart. So we need to get back to where we were with my brother and do something that's more that's more complex. I mean,
this goes to the loyalty thing, though. I wonder if he would be hesitant to publicly. It just goes against their sort of chivalry, this Bush chivalry, to publicly in any way criticize Rumsfeld, or throw him under the bus. I just don't know that they would do it. And by the way, shouldn't we have learned from Vietnam about counterinsurgency strategy? Did we need this? Wasn't that something we should have learned from the Vietnam experience?
Well, I've noticed that it seems to be right now. I've heard this now from Scott Walker and from John Kasich just yesterday. Because obviously it's fashionable to say Obama sucks with ISIS and everything's his fault. So you got to get to Obama's right, apparently, in this battle. So that on one hand, Obama is he's too politically correct that he won't call us radical Islam, blah blah blah. But on the other hand, he's using drones and he's backing a military coalition in Iraq and Syria, and obviously has a military strategy to go after them. So you can't just say we have to use the military because he is using the military. You have to go one more if you want to get to the right of Obama. And so now Scott Walker and Kasich are saying, well, we have to have boots on the ground. I think Kasich was more definitive. I think Walker is a bit more circumspect, but he still used the phrasing. And I would suspect that there isn't a huge appetite for that in the public still. Whatever frustrations they have with the current policy, it doesn't automatically lead to someone to say, let's just get in there, let's just go all in. So that's what I'm waiting for Jeb to say, look, we did simplistic before. My brother did simplistic before, and it didn't work. And he adapted to the mistake and corrected it and did something more sophisticated. We need to be sophisticated about this problem, not juvenile.
Well, there's a really interesting article, Bill. Everyone essentially read it in The Atlantic about what ISIS really wants. And it was interesting because this article argued a lot of things, but one of the things is that it's apocalyptic, and that they want to draw us in because they essentially want to bring about the end of the world. It's reminded of Charles Manson. People forget that that was sort of his game plan, this race war or whatever. So it's interesting, and we have to be careful, as I think Obama is very careful about the notion that playing into their hands by giving them what they want, by being drawn into something. I think he calls it strategic patience or something.
Well, I mean,
But
that's more of a broader element of this national security strategy that they used before. I think that was more applicable to Syria. How do you deal with the Assad problem? Uh,
I think Republicans can distance themselves from Obama easily without talking about boots on the ground, because I think the obvious difference is that Obama doesn't want to enter into any sort of any moral clarity of like, this is us versus them, and that we are fighting for Western civilization versus barbarism. He doesn't want to go there.
right.
And we had this out last week. Don't want to get into it again, but the most recent example would be the beheading of, I think it was 21 Christian martyrs in Libya, which I believe the administration described as just Libyan citizens, something of that effect, not noting the obvious fact that they were intentionally and obviously selected because of their religion, which comes on the heels, of course, of the kosher grocery store that was, according to the Obama administration, random. There's obviously a pattern. They do not want to deal with reality or concede. It's funny because like the opposite of the hate crimes thing. Like, I mean, these are hate crimes, but they want to just pretend that they're just regular random things. I don't know. It's weird. But I think that's how Republicans could just easily talk about the importance of a leader, whether it's Churchill or Reagan with Reagan with the evil empire, Churchill's rhetoric during World War II, that it's important for leaders to call out their opponents what they are, the evil empire or whatever, and just sort of give rhetorical leadership, and marshal people to battle with ideas and with words, and that Obama is essentially AWOL on that part of presidential leadership. I mean, I don't think you even need to go to boots on the ground. That's such an easy point, an obvious point to make. Why would they need to go anywhere else?
Well, let me shift gears and talk about Scott Walker, because he's still kind of the hot ticket in conservative quarters. He's polling pretty strongly in most Iowa and New Hampshire polls that we've seen. Some better than others, but he's still definitely in the top tier, I think, in every poll that I've seen as of late. But there still is this sort of underlying question, because he's sort of new on the national stage. Is he ready for prime time? There's a lot of articles about his college years. He dropped out of college before his senior year. Although he was, I actually thought he was kind of only short a few credits. He actually was short a lot of credits. And he was a very active person politically. He was displaying his conservative politics in the campus political sphere, mostly unsuccessfully. And so now it's sort of hanging over his head. Can someone without a BA become president? I think Truman was the last one. Do you have any big thoughts on that, Matt?
Yeah, well, I don't know if I have any big thoughts on it, but first, Bill, as we've discussed here, as you know intimately, I'm writing a book. The book is about the book is called Too Dumb to Fail, and it is about how conservatism was once a proud intellectual philosophy, got dumbed down, and how we can get it back, essentially. And I name names and I call out people who I think are dumbing down politics. This is, of course, a bipartisan issue, but I think it's kind of disproportionately hit the right. I think it's because there are strains of populism, and we talk about this in the book, that are sort of the right is susceptible to, that are sort of disproportionately influencing it for various reasons. But I don't see Scott Walker as at all, like, of all the problems that I'm diagnosing in the book and of all the people that I think are offenders, he's pretty much at the bottom of my list. So this is credentialism. It's not anti-intellectualism. It's not obscurantism. It's I mean, again, Truman, pretty good president, not a college grad. Ronald Reagan went to Eureka College. I think that that the problem with the dumbing down is not is has very little or nothing to do with formal education. It has to do with things like with wisdom. It has to do with things like intellectual curiosity and intellectual honesty. There are a lot of people who are college graduates who are frankly not all that bright, not all that curious. There are plenty of people who never went to college who are brilliant entrepreneurs, inventors, and so I'm in the camp where I think this is a bad thing. I guess it was Howard Dean is the one guy who kind of went on the record and said this was an issue. I just, Bill, I just don't see it. He doesn't, I mean, if being governor of Wisconsin, if doing the things he's done, seems to be a smart, articulate guy, I just don't see it as I don't see it as a problem. I don't see it as a problem for me as someone who wants conservatives who are articulate, smart, and wise.
Yeah, and I generally agree with that. I don't feel like, I mean, it raises a question. I think if he said a bunch of stupid things over the course of the campaign, it would then create a narrative that he was not a smart person. But just like Reagan overcame the age question when he came up with a sharp quip to show that he still had his faculties, it just sets a bar for you to clear. And so far as governor, he hasn't been a bumbling governor. You may obviously virulently disagree with his policies, but he hasn't been come across as a dummy. So I wouldn't think that in and of itself would create an explicit problem for him. What I do think might create a problem for him, and I think that your book kind of gets at this to a large degree, is how worldly is Scott Walker? How broad is his knowledge? I mean, Harry Truman, who didn't go to college, was deeply steeped in history, far more than most people knew when he became president.
And also, in World War I as well. I mean, so he
was in World War I.
He was in World War I. So I mean, he was well traveled.
Yes.
Not just in the show me statement.
He had that life experience. What I've read about Walker so far, I'm just learning in a way that a lot of other people are. He really seems to exist almost purely in a conservative movement bubble. And being a guy who was idolizing Reagan from his adolescence, and was playing that up as a college student in politics. Never seemed to have any kind of phase where he kind of broke out of that and thought about the world in a different way. There's a great piece in the New Republic from this past June. I think it was Alex McGillis, if I remember correctly, who wrote it. He said he kind of undercut the notion that Walker is sort of uniquely suited to be the Republican nominee because he's been so successful in such a blue state. And that's sort of the main argument. I'm in Wisconsin. Obama's won this twice. Yet I've won 3 times in 4 years, and I haven't moderated myself one iota. I've been a steadfast conservative, and I've proven you can win here. Therefore, I must have some special sauce that could win in swing states other places. But what the New Republic article point out is he didn't build his success on winning over Wisconsin swing voters. He took advantage of the very polarized nature of Wisconsin politics. It's a hugely racially segregated state, and a lot of tension between white suburbs and black inner cities. Not to say that Walker, is a racist, but just he took advantage of this political dynamic to jack up the conservative base vote and play off of their distrust of, the sense of, they're taking my money and giving it to somebody else. That kind of grievance politic, he was very adept at playing off of that. And he hasn't needed to go beyond that to win in the off-year elections that he has been competing in. He hasn't had to win in a year where Obama was on the ballot and a different demographic was turning out in a presidential year. So there's no evidence based on that alone that he can win in Colorado or Nevada or North Carolina or even another Midwest state like Ohio. So my point, going back to your book, is he doesn't seem to display the cosmopolitan nature which you talk about that Reagan had. That Reagan was a much more worldly figure. than Walker has been. So that might necessarily be a voting issue for people, but it might come through in more implicit and subtle ways.
Yeah. People, I guess I'd say two things, Bill. I think, first, I'll start with Rick Perry. I think that Perry had the same problem you're talking about in a sense. I think he was very, parochial. I mean, very focused on Texas and understood the energy and Texas issues, but not somebody who sat around thinking the way that Newt Gingrich has thought about big ideas for his whole life, and has thought about foreign policy and economics. And, I don't think that Rick Perry wrestled with like grand, theology, philosophy, or international so I think when he ran for president, he was really jumping in the deep end unprepared. He had been a very good, by most accounts, governor of Texas, longest serving governor in America. But so I think that that's a good point. I would say, and I'll use Perry as an example here again. Perry hails from Texas, and he has the Texas swagger, which some people find appealing and some people find a turnoff. And unfortunately, and maybe unfairly, probably unfairly, there's a thing where a lot of people from a lot of parts of the country attribute a Texas or a Southern or even a Sarah Palin, North Dakota, Alaska accent with lack of intelligence. So if you carry yourself in a certain Southern way, let's say, or have a Southern twang or an accent, people, fair or not, and possibly not, but people will attribute that to a lack of sophistication, a lack of intelligence.
People used to say that, how could Jimmy Carter get elected president? He's a Southerner. How would America elect a Southerner? And then you had a period in the 90s where you could only elect Southerners. The Southerners were only the pure Americans, and now we're kind of back to where we were before.
Yeah. Well, and Jimmy Carter also was a nuclear submariner and a graduate of the Naval Academy of Annapolis. His IQ must have been, Carter was incredibly intelligent and by most accounts a failed president. So there goes that analogy. But anyway, my point is that there's nothing about Scott Walker that viscerally makes you think he's stupid. Like, he doesn't carry himself. He doesn't have an accent that would lead you to believe, like the sort of shibboleths, He fits in. Like, I feel like he could fit in he could be in D.C. or New York and culturally, stylistically fit in. Now, I do think he's got the sort of boring, uncharismatic Midwestern thing, but in terms of like intelligence, I don't think that there's anything about his body manner or the way that he talks that would lead you to believe that would sort of subtly suggest that he's not smart, even though we know that those things are superficial. They do matter. But what do you think about that, Bill?
Well, I agree. I think he's not someone who comes across as an idiot. So that's why I don't think that not having a degree, wouldn't necessarily be a problem as he starts saying things that are, if he starts getting the names of world leaders wrong, for example, then I think he's got a problem. But there's no evidence that he has that problem yet. I just don't know if he knows how to, and I think being locked in a conservative bubble is probably just fine for a Republican primary. That's not an imminent problem there. The question is, what happens when he's got to pivot to a general election electorate that's not like the electorate he's had to face before, when his entire life has been in this bubble. Most presidential figures have to be, calibrate depending on their audience. You're competing in a big country, a lot of different states, a lot of different regions, and we just haven't seen that from him. Look, some people step up. You can go back to some of Obama's early 2007 appearances, and they're not good. He seemed pretty raw and pretty unprepared in some things, but the guy took those mistakes to heart and stepped up his game. People can step up their games, but obviously it's very early to see if Scott Walker's capable of doing that.
Well, I think two things there. One, this whole narrative that Walker's been living in this conservative bubble Does that just come from something you read? Where does that like that to me
Well, that's the New
just
Republic piece. The
feels
New Republic piece sort of
okay?
that's sort of the main thing that lays it out. But also, there's been pieces recently in the Boston Globe about his college career that also buttress that even at that young age, even in his high school days, like he was just sort of always uh, a conservative purist and never had like a moment of introspection and questioning about that. That's sort of the vibe you get from these. Now, maybe there'll be other pieces that come out that give you a more complicated narrative.
Yeah.
That's what I've seen so far.
The other weird thing, Bill, is I don't know why this happened, but I feel like I am always going the other way. Like I feel like for some reason I know how to connect with liberals. Like in other words, I feel like I know how to um, present conservative positions in a way that liberals and or people who are not conservatives would like understand and potentially appreciate. And there is a bubble, and I'll tell you how I know there's a bubble, or how it just occurred to me recently. You remember Scott Walker was over in London, and he was asked this question about evolution, and he punted on that question. Well, this spawns quite a few people to write things that were like, "Here's how Scott Walker should have responded to the evolution question," and 90% of the things that I read were horrible answers that would have gotten him in much more trouble with the media than punting. And these are all smart people who like really thought, here's what I would have told him, and they really believed that the answer that they would have presented would have worked and would have like either persuaded the media or shut the media up or whatever, and it would have been a disaster because they have no idea. I think that some of these conservatives have no conception of how liberals think, or of what sells, like what will work with them. And for some reason, I feel like that's one of my gifts. I don't know. I think it's a combination of like, number one, I've been talking to you for all these years. Number two, I've done a lot of like MSNBC where I had to figure out how to make arguments. And I've written for, outlets like The Week and Politics Daily that were, mainstream or even liberal leaning. But I think the real reason, Bill, is that I grew up inundated by pop culture. Like I grew up in a really rural and conservative area, and and that influences me greatly. But I also watched TV constantly, like way too much television. Like my parents should not have probably let me watch as much television as I watched. But it also kept me from becoming a redneck. It's sort of a weird yin and yang. Like I think it helped me in some ways, but as a parent, you have to guard against the TV values. Like it's a challenge I have right now with my kids. But I think it taught me like what liberals are like and what works with them and what doesn't work and like what will sell and what won't. And I think that like a lot of times conservatives in the bubble get these ideas that they think, oh yeah, I'm going to say this, and when I say that, they'll have no response or they'll have to agree. And it's a disaster, and they have no conception strategically of how of messaging. Anyway, it's a rant, but
well, speaking of that, though, we've got a few minutes left. I want to touch on this quickly. We have this looming immigration / homeland security battle, where at the end of the month, if there's no funding bill passed, this was the leftover piece of the Cromnibus bill in December. There's the one agency that did not get funding through September was Homeland Security, because they wanted that to be leverage over Obama to get him to rescind his immigration deportation relief, which was kind of crazy because the presumption was if Homeland Security gets shut down, Obama wouldn't take the blame for it. Republicans would, for playing the same childish game they did in 2013. House passed the bill that rescinds the order. Senate can't pass it because Democrats filibuster it. Senate leaders say, look, we can't pass this, House. You got to send us a bill with that's different. And the House refused to oblige, saying we got to put more pressure on the Democrats. You got to blame the Democrats. You got to keep putting it on the floor and twisting their arms. And where they're in total stalemate about it with not a lot of days left, not a lot of legislative days left. Now you have this complication that a federal judge in Texas who was a Bush appointee, who had previously been highly critical of Obama's immigration policy, has implemented an injunction against implementing the deportation relief. He didn't technically rule it to be unconstitutional. He said, "I'm doing this injunction as a precursor to then later rule on the merits." And this raises a question, I think, for Republicans. And this comes back to your point: how do our arguments play beyond our own base? What argument would properly affix the blame now in case of a shutdown? Would it be that Republicans can say, aha, Obama's order has been struck down by a judge. This proves Obama's the one that's out of line. And if he won't accept our law rescinding his order, he'll take the fall for the shutdown? Or could you say that, well, Obama is agreeing to the order. He's accepting the judge's ruling. He's going to appeal the ruling, go up to the Supreme Court with it. But for the time being, he's not ignoring the ruling. He's following. He's delaying the program. You could argue that, okay, we don't have to worry about Obama running roughshod over the Constitution because it's being handled in the appropriate judicial channel. Let's get Congress out of it, strip out the part of the Homeland Security bill that deals with immigration, and just let the courts deal with it. And that's our escape hatch from having a shutdown to blow back on the Republicans. It all comes down to how you think the public's going to react to this set of circumstances, and there's no obvious map to determine how it's going to be, except for the fact that every shutdown that's happened to this date gets blamed on Republicans. So I would think that would make you pause. But Matt, you might have a different take on how you think Republicans are going to interpret this set of developments.
A lot to say. Yes, Republicans will be blamed. They were blamed in 2013, and it was hurting them. And I think they fell about 10 points in Gallup, and yet they won the 2014 midterms, which is not to say that it didn't hurt them, but it is to say that it was not devastating. There was time to recover, and so I think it did cost Republicans a Virginia gubernatorial race. So there was collateral damage, but we've also seen, I think the one example where something like this sort of worked was the sequester, where, everybody was like wringing their hands about how bad the sequester is going to be, and it turned out to really be not as bad, not as catastrophic as people thought. Actually helped Obama with the deficit, bringing down the deficit. So you have these. So there's a theory that says, like, I don't think anybody can argue that it won't hurt Republicans. I don't think anybody can argue that Democrats will be blamed. Logically, you could argue that they should be. I don't think anybody can really, in all seriousness, argue that Democrats are going to be blamed. So then the question is, does it matter? So maybe Republicans ought to do this just on principle. And also to appease their base, to show their base that they are listening, and that they take seriously Obama's overreach and sort of unconstitutional maneuvering. So that's a theory. Republicans take a hit, they do this, but again, a lot of the Department of Homeland Security, the majority of the employees are. Will have to go to work because they're not deemed. What's the word I'm looking for here, Bill? Non-essential. They're not non-essential.
Almost all Homeland Security is essential. So but they wouldn't get paid if it shut down.
Well,
so you'd have a huge issue of staff morale. If you got like 200,000 Homeland Security employees who aren't getting paid for their work.
Okay, so now let's run the cost-benefit analysis and weigh the pros and the cons. Okay, the pros are. You were at least symbolically doing something to take a symbolic stand against Obama's sort of overreach and his encroachment on balance of powers. And you make your base happy and satisfy your base. Those, I think, are the only pros. The cons are, number one, this couldn't pass the Senate because they would filibuster, and if it did pass the Senate, it would be vetoed. Number two, even if you shut down, defund part of DHS, the part that funds Obama's programs that you don't like come from fees, so you can't stop the things that you actually want to stop. Number three, even if you hurt DHS, the essential workers will still work. And here's where I think, to me, this is why it's a bad idea. What if there is some sort of a terrorist attack on the country during this all? Would it not be incredibly easy for Democrats to demagogue the fact that we weren't prepared, or that while this horrible thing was happening, the preparations were being made, Republicans were playing politics, and they were not fully funding the Department of Homeland Security? That seems to me to be a real risky. So it's high risk and really low reward. So I feel like I've tried to be kind of intellectually honest and walk Republicans through this process of why I come down on it. Like, I don't think it's political suicide, because I think, maybe it just blows over, or maybe there's, the next election's not until, a year and a half away. But it just seems like the one potential chance that something really horrific could happen, which would be horrible, of course, in its own right, and that Republicans would, though, be blamed. And that could last a generation, that kind of thing. So I think it's high risk, low reward. What do you think, Bill?
I agree with you, and two, I have to go. So
I knew if I filibustered, I'd have my way. All right. Catch you next week.
Take care.